Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Chloe.
I'm Billi.
When starting a family becomes challenging, can Australians truly depend on the sector designed to support them? That's the question that the peak body for the fertility sector in Australia recently sought to answer. And their findings? Not quite. They found that the current system discriminates against non-traditional families. It's legislated inconsistently across Australia and may not be well placed to address future demand for reproductive technologies. So they've proposed a new plan to overhaul how reproductive technologies, so things like IVF, are accessed and regulated in Australia. We'll tell you what you need to know in today's deep dive.
So Chloe, today we are talking about this new plan that was proposed to overhaul the assisted reproductive technology sector. And that's because there's a rise in the need for these assisted reproductive technologies. Now, I've never heard of that word before. It's quite a mouthful. Before we get started, what does it actually mean?
So when we talk about assisted reproductive technologies, what we really mean is any treatment or procedure that is helping someone with their fertility. So the most common one people will know about is in vitro fertilization.
So IVF.
IVF. But it can also mean things like frozen embryo transfer.
Right.
Now, if we look at IVF specifically, in 2021, there were 18,594 babies born in Australia using IVF.
Wow, that's quite a lot.
Yeah, and it's expected to grow, with the Fertility Society saying it's going to exponentially increase.
Wow, why?
It's for a couple of different reasons. Firstly, much like the rest of the developed world, Australian women are waiting until they are much older before they have their first baby. They're also having a lot less babies, but that's probably not relevant as much to the IVF conversation. So the median age for women giving birth in Australia reached 31.9 years old in 2022, and that's up from 25.4 in 1971. And as I mentioned, parents are also having fewer babies. The birth rate has fallen from 3.5 children per woman in 1960 to 1.63 in 2022. So the average Australian woman is having their first baby at 32-ish, and they're only going on average to have 1 to 2 babies.
So interesting. Do we know why?
I mean, there's lots of different reasons why women are choosing to either not have babies or they're pushing it back. That can be cultural reasons. Women enjoy having more choices and independence with their career and all those things we know. Financial, people can't afford to have babies in the cost of living crisis. So that's maybe why people are choosing to push it back. But we know the reality is that older mothers are at greater risk of experiencing reproductive challenges, which means on the whole that more people are likely to be seeking those reproductive technologies.
Right.
Now, the rising demand for assisted reproductive technologies is also compounded by a rising number of same-sex couples and solo parents.
Okay, so just to take stock of where we're at, we know that parents are having babies at a later age and they're also having less babies. But at the same time, there are more and more parents who are needing to use reproductive technologies for a number of different reasons that you laid out. So today we're talking about it because there was this new report that came out last week that proposed a new plan to assist the rise in these technologies or assist the rise in the need for these technologies. So what did that report say?
Well, that was the question of how do we cope then? So it laid out a plan saying what do we need to address to make sure the sector has capacity.
Right.
So this new report, which was co-authored by former Health Minister Greg Hunt.
I know him.
Do you?
From the pandemic. Not personally, just from the TV.
Billy's friend, Greg Hunt.
No.
And public health expert Dr. Rachel Swift. And the pair recognised the demand that's going to be coming for these technologies, as we were talking about, and basically looked at where the holes are in the system and what we need to do to ensure the sector is robust as it needs to be.
Okay, so what did it say?
One of the main issues discussed was the barriers to accessing this fertility treatment, and particularly the financial costs that are involved. And a lot of people might find that unsurprising. The review noted that an IVF treatment can cost up to $10,000 per cycle.
Wow. And a lot of the time people have to do more than one cycle.
Yeah. So the review labelled this as an enormous economic burden on Australian families. Now, while some Medicare access is available, which could bring those costs down for some families, the review said that the clinical definitions of infertility had caused long-standing barriers to access, including discrimination. So to unpack that a little bit more, in terms of definitions, in a clinical setting, infertility is described as the inability to conceive after 1 year of regular unprotected intercourse. Now, if you consider people who fall outside of that framework, so they might be same-sex couples, or think about solo parents, they are therefore restricted from accessing Medicare benefits.
So because the definition of infertility specifically says unprotected intercourse, for those in same-sex relationships or solo parents, they are basically excluded from that definition and therefore don't have access to get rebates from Medicare.
Yeah.
Is that right?
It's really looking at a man and a woman who can't conceive.
I see.
So one expert who contributed to the report said it's a serious anomaly that while heterosexual couples receive Medicare support to resolve their fertility problems and have their families, people in other family circumstances receive no support at all for their fertility problems. So the review recommended the definition be updated to ensure non-discriminatory access to IVF and reproductive technologies.
Wow, I had no idea that the definition of infertility was officially so narrow. I guess because society feels so much more advanced than that, it does feel surprising. But outside of access, did the report identify any other problems with the sector?
Yeah, so it addressed how confusing the legislative barriers can be for families to navigate. Because this is a state-run issue, there's over 30 pieces of legislation for all the states and territories.
Wow.
So depending on where you are in Australia, you are going to have varying rules about donor samples, the quality standards for donations, and regulations surrounding IVF procedures.
So basically there's a lack of uniformity across Australia when it comes to this sector.
Yeah, the review called it a primary concern that significantly impacts children, parents, donors, and costs.
And so what did the report say is the solution to that? I imagine just having one piece of legislation federally?
Yep, one law for the country. They said by putting everyone on the same rule book, the report argues that that approach is going to guarantee consistent reproductive and privacy standards around the country. So to get in the weeds of that, the review suggested national fertility legislation to streamline regulations between all of the states and territories. It also suggested establishing a national register and then a national genetic bank. So that is going to centralise all the genetic information from donors and donor-conceived children into the one spot. It also suggested a national health standard for egg and sperm donation, so everyone's on the same page. So this is all a proposal from fertility experts to say to the government, this is what we think should happen in the next 10 years to meet demand. So to make it actually happen, it called on health ministers to support the roadmap. So they say by ensuring consistent legislation across the country, this will lead to improved and more equitable outcomes for Australian families.
Okay, so this is calling on the health ministers to make a change. What do the health ministers say?
Well, I reached out, I called the government, and a spokesperson for Health Minister Mark Butler said that the government was going to carefully consider the report.
So no commitment, but I guess a commitment to looking into it.
Yeah, they're going to take it seriously.
And what about the opposition?
On the other side of politics, we also reached out to Shadow Minister Anne Ruston, who said that the opposition was also examining the findings and recommendations. Ruston also acknowledged that more work was needed to improve policies. She said it was important to recognise the difficulties faced by Australians dealing with infertility challenges. So I think that when we have these conversations, Billi, it's easy to get caught up in legislation and definitions and acronyms. And I think because this is such a deeply personal topic, it's important to centre the families that are behind this. Because we're talking about people's ability to start and grow families and the ways in which technology can hinder or help that process. So I reached out to Arabella Gibson, who is the CEO of Gidget Foundation Australia. And she said that for families dealing with fertility challenges, we know that frequent experiences of loss can create repeated cycles of hope and disappointment among parents, as well as feelings of grief for the baby they never got to meet. She added that supporting parent-led conversations on a national level is crucial to reducing the barriers parents struggling with conception may face.
Such an important topic, and I have to admit it's one that I didn't know a lot about. I learned so much from you explaining that. Thank you so much, Chloe.
Thank you so much, Billi.
And thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Daily Aus. At the moment, we are running a survey to understand what it is that you like about the podcast that we do and also what you think that we could improve on. We will put a link to that in today's show notes. But thank you so much for listening, and we'll be back again tomorrow.